So this is just a little blurb courtesy of Real GM that says, quote, Russell Westbrook is more likely to not be on the Lakers' active roster at the start of training camp after the team traded for Patrick Beverley. Sources told Jovan Buha of The Athletic. Buha adds that the team could either trade Westbrook or send him home, similar to the situation between John Wall and the Houston Rockets. The Lakers officially acquired Patrick Beverley for Talen Horton-Tucker and Stanley Johnson. This happened last week. This is a very fascinating situation between the Lakers and, just as I expected, between the Lakers, between Russell Westbrook, and between Patrick Beverley. The acquisition of Patrick Beverley was 100% totally overlooked, especially now that this insane assumption came out. So you look at Patrick Beverley. Patrick Beverley brings some much needed help. On defense, the Lakers, if I remember correctly, were one of the worst defensive teams in the league last season, even with Anthony Davis, even with Russell Westbrook. Patrick Beverley is also someone you can bring off the bench to help facilitate the offense, someone who doesn't need the ball in his hands to be effective, makes most of his scoring opportunities off of catch and shoot threes, and overall, he just seems to fit better on the Lakers than Russell Westbrook does. I see where the Russell Westbrook Patrick Beverley beef came from, because they did exchange words a couple years ago when Russ was like, all Patrick Beverley does is just run around. He did that whole he tricked y'all stuff like that, and then Patrick Beverley fired back. And I'm not really sure that these guys have actual beef. I'm sure there's no love lost on the court, that's for sure. But when you're teammates with someone, you kind of just suck it up. But the assumption that the Lakers would just send Russ home or, not make him a part of the team is just an insane one, because they have the roster to be significantly better than they are, and yet they aren't. And it is more of an indictment on the front office and of the organization than it is on Russell Westbrook. And of course, they make the comparison like John Wall. There's a fundamental difference between the Rockets team that John Wall was on that won 17 games and the Los Angeles Lakers, who could seemingly contend to be the 4th or 5th seed in the Western Conference. Houston was not contending for anything. They were contending for a lottery spot. And the Rockets and John Wall understood that it was not in their best interest to play him, because if he plays and he gets hurt, or if he plays and he plays like shit, it would be harder to deal him, which is ultimately what both sides wanted. John Wall wanted to be off the Rockets so he could contend for a title, and the Rockets wanted to be rid of John Wall so that way they didn't have to pay his contract, and, just so they could give more time to developing their younger core. The Lakers are not in that situation. With the right moves, I don't think the Lakers are a contender, but they're a contender to be a middle of the pack playoff team. And it's for reasons like this that I feel bad for Russell Westbrook. And I'm not a Russell Westbrook stan. I think stan behavior is just super weird. But I'm not necessarily agnostic towards Russell Westbrook, because over the last decade or so, his rise has been so meteoric, and he's risen into being one of the most polarizing players in the NBA, which is super shocking. And he is a great player with a great resume who was not so productive on the Lakers. And it's because of everything that he's done in the past, multiple seasons of averaging triple doubles. I see why he's built himself a sizable fan base, and he's also cemented himself as one of the greatest point guards the league has ever seen. However, there are definite flaws in his game. He's a terrible three-point shooter, and his offense really hasn't evolved since he's come into the league. He plays a bit loosey-goosey with the basketball at times as well, but we've seen that from every high-usage point guard over the last decade or so who's not named Chris Paul. Any guy who plays as many possessions as Russell Westbrook does, and especially the possessions that he played with the Thunder, he was bound to turn the ball over a lot because he was the only one initiating offense. But there are flaws in his game, understandably, just like every other player. But those flaws are exacerbated with him being on the Lakers. And the reason I feel bad for Russell Westbrook is that he never had to be in this situation. And this is, again, why I keep trying to tie everything that happens with the Lakers, all of their shortcomings, back to the front office. Because 2 years ago, Russ is on the Wizards. He was content playing on the Wizards. He was putting up numbers, He was averaging like 22 points and like 7 boards, 7 assists playing alongside Bradley Beal. There wasn't any pressure, there were no stakes. And all he said was, if the Lakers come calling, I would consider playing for them. It's his hometown team. Who wouldn't want to play for their hometown team? And of course, this was back before like the talent level in the Western Conference. Well, I don't really want to say that, but it was before the Western Conference was as tightly packed as it is now, at least on top, at least at the top. And no one foresaw the Lakers collapsing as badly as they have. But he never demanded a trade. He didn't force his way out of Washington. He was content to play on the Wizards and just kind of like, play out the last few good years of his prime. And then next thing you know, he gets traded. And the minute this fucking trade happens, I was not pleased. I was not pleased with the Lakers with this trade because they mortgaged their depth to bring on a guy who everyone knew was not going to fit alongside LeBron James. It takes a very unique type of player to play adequately alongside LeBron. It requires a Dwayne Wade type player or a Kyrie Irving type player, namely a guard who has a very well-rounded offensive repertoire, who can create his own shot in a variety of ways, and isn't so playmaking forward, which is what Russell Westbrook. He's a great playmaker because of his athleticism, because of his ability to get to the cup, but in regards to shot creation, he is average at best. And the Lakers knew this, or I mean, they seemingly had to have known this because it later came out that this was, I made a video on this as well. This was when Magic Johnson I think he blamed LeBron. I can't remember who he blamed, but he wasn't blaming the front office for the Lakers' downfall this past season. And I'm like, this is entirely the Lakers' front office's fault because before they swung that trade for Russell Westbrook, where they got rid of Montrezl Harrell, where they got rid of Kentavious Caldwell-Pope, you know who they were in discussions with? DeMar DeRozan. DeMar DeRozan was chatting with LeBron. DeMar DeRozan, who is a multifaceted and a versatile shot creator, would have fared infinitely better on the Lakers than Russell Westbrook has or would have. It's obvious. It's just the two play styles that these guys have are significantly different. One of them is conducive to the success of the Lakers, or at least in theory it is, and the other one is not. And the one that is not is Russell Westbrook. So he doesn't force his way out of DC. He gets traded to the Lakers. And the coaching staff also really doesn't make any attempt to integrate him. And I don't know if Rob Pelinka thought that they would be able to assimilate this quickly, especially considering just like the inconsistencies in the Lakers lineup. Where are they getting their bench production from? Their defense is faltering. Anthony Davis is in and out of the lineup. LeBron has to put in all this extra work to make sure that the team doesn't fucking crash and burn. And then there's Russell Westbrook, who, while all of this is going on, is also trying to fit himself into the offense and play a role that he's never played before. Yes, he played next to a secondary star in Kevin Durant. He played secondary star to Kevin Durant, and he played secondary star to James Harden. But neither Kevin Durant nor James Harden are LeBron James. Kevin Durant is not a point forward. He's not a guy who's going to facilitate the offense that frequently. I mean, he can do it, and he's become a much better facilitator over his career. But that's different than when these two guys were playing in OKC, and then he goes to Houston. And weirdly enough, Russ has arguably the best season of his career with the Rockets. He averaged like 27 points and shot 47% from the field or something like that. It was crazy, and it was because that was also a team that played to Russ's strength. They got out and ran in transition. Russ at that point was still he still is an incredible athlete, but he was an even better athlete back then. He was a few years younger, which goes a long way when it comes to your explosiveness. They were getting out in transition. He was playing alongside James Harden, who he already had chemistry with from when they were in OKC. And more importantly, he was allowed to play his game because the Rockets didn't have such a strict game plan. I mean, their game plan obviously was threes and layups, but they were just playing off of James Harden. And as long as James Harden was, setting up Russ or deferring to Russ, the offense was fine. Of course, that's really not a team that you're going to win a championship with, I don't think. But both of those were different situations. And so, again, he comes to the Lakers not against his will, but in a fucking horrible decision by Rob Pelinka. They mortgage their depth, as I already mentioned. They bring in Russell Westbrook, and then they're not even allowing their team time to gel, which you need when you try to incorporate multiple star players. They're not going to come together right away, especially when there are a sizable amount of other moving pieces. It's just the Lakers management is so fucking just bad. I don't think they properly understand what it takes to build the type of team that they want to build, because let's not forget, this is a Lakers team that is only 2 years removed from winning an NBA title. And that team was the best iteration of that team because you had LeBron healthy. Well, I mean, the health thing is a different piece. I don't want to harp on that too much because that's out of control of the Lakers front office. But they had depth. They had Trez. They had KCP. They had Alex Caruso. They had that was also, I think, the team with JaVale McGee, if I remember. But they had Rajon Rondo as well, I believe. And they saw the success of that team with Frank Vogel, mind you. They got rid of all the guys, all the integral pieces off the bench. They axed the coach, and they're going to go ahead and win 30 games this year or 35 games this year. And again, the front office is going to come in and just start fucking around with everything. Like, I don't necessarily hate the Patrick Beverley addition. I think Patrick Beverley is a very valuable contributor to a lot of teams. He plays with an edge. Granted, yeah, he's really fucking annoying when he's on the court, but like, sometimes you need that. You need pests. You need guys who are going to play with an edge. And also, you kind of accept it when he backs that up because he is one of the premier perimeter defenders in the NBA. I can't envision a world where you can't have Russell Westbrook and Patrick Beverley. Even if this means bringing Russell Westbrook off the bench. Like, that's an entirely different conversation. I know there was a report at the beginning of the summer, and it was like Darvin Ham will have more authority to bench Russell Westbrook. I'm like, if that's what they feel is best for the team, then Russ is going to have to accept it. It's obviously not fair, but like, you have to prove that you're a starter, right? So obviously on paper, Russ is still probably the best option for the Lakers, but the front office needs to stop fucking with everything. I can't stress this point enough. Obviously, Russ has not played up to the standards that we're used to seeing him. 18 points, shot 44% from the field, 30% from three, right about his career average, 7 assists, 7 rebounds. This was not an atrocious season from Russell Westbrook. He can still produce. He can't produce as effectively because, again, his play style isn't conducive alongside LeBron, but that's not to say that you should just kick him to the curb. That's just a shitty way to treat him. It shows a lack of confidence in his ability to adapt, and it shows a lack of confidence in like that you're essentially giving up on him when you have no reason to yet because he isn't the sole issue on the Lakers. Okay? Their depth fucking sucks now. Anthony Davis has not played like the former number 1 overall pick. He's been in and out of the lineup. The only Laker who is exempt from blame is LeBron James, and that's because he's 107 years old and he just finished like third in the league in scoring. He's the only guy exempt from blame on the Lakers. I'm not a Russell Westbrook stan by any means. I think that I respect his greatness. I respect him as a player. I don't know him as a person, but I'm sure he's a cool guy. And a first ballot Hall of Famer who I'm sure will get the Dwight Howard and the Melo. He'll get the Dwight treatment and the Melo treatment at some point. But like, this is just ridiculous, man. The scapegoating that the Lakers are doing and that the media is doing is just like, it's just fucking annoying because folks know better. Folks know that Russell Westbrook isn't the only problem with the Lakers. And then to pin that on him and then to perpetuate this allegedly bogus feud. I mean, Jeannie Buss said that it was a bogus beef between him and Patrick Beverley, but she also misspoke and said that Russ was the best player on the Lakers last year, and then attributed that to him playing 78 games, which, yes, he was the healthiest player last year, but again, I don't know if it's just like NBA media's inability to appropriately characterize a player, but Russ is always overrated or underrated. Like, for whatever reason, people can't just look at him and be like, yeah, he underperformed this year, but it was his first year on a new team in a new system alongside some new teammates, and admittedly, his numbers aren't that bad. At least his efficiency numbers, which has never been that great anyway. But I'm starting to ramble here. I think that Russ stays on the Lakers this year, and if he doesn't, I think he'll land somewhere else in the NBA. I don't necessarily know where, because that's always hard to project, because what's the contract situation going to be look like? Would a team maybe try to trade for him? Like, I don't know. I don't know. And it's also this weird thing, and I think Bill Simmons said this, but like, if you're a young team, he's too young to bring into a young team, because he can still contribute. I think that Russell Westbrook can still contribute to a championship level team. So his talents will be underutilized on a bad team, but also what caliber of contending team would be able to sign him? Like, whether it's for cap reasons or whether it's for just like roster reasons, I don't know, but we'll see.